Good morning. I hope you're doing well this morning. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of this historical period and Beloved, which we'll be reading for this week. We're moving into literature that's more closely aligned with contemporary African American literature. I'm calling this unit Revisions to highlight one of the significant trends that I see in African American literature during this period, namely a real desire among African American writers to revisit the African American literary tradition and recreate it for the purposes of the present. In the historical moment of the Black arts movement, the imperative for African American writers is pretty explicit. Their literature and writing is supposed to be there to serve the political needs and aims of the greater African American community. And Toni Morrison is certainly writing into that tradition, but her perspective on what it means to be political is much more nuanced. She was much more attentive to the aesthetics, beauty, and power of African American ways of speaking, for example. That shift is already apparent by the time we get to the writing of the women of the Black arts. You may have noticed that there's a lot more attention to that in the writing of Alice Walker, Audre Lorde, for example. Toni Morrison says in Rootedness, the Ancestor as Foundation that, quote, the work must be political, yes, but that there's a problem when you find harangue passing off as art. Art has to be, she says, unquestioningly political and irrevocably beautiful at the same time. So what we get in Morrison is a writer who very confidently dips in and out of and reinvents the Western literary canon, but who also is simultaneously grounded in the language of African American culture and African American oral tradition. So she's definitely doing something that's a little bit different from some of those writers of the Black arts movement. Her novel Beloved also works as a revision because it's what we call a neo-slave narrative. The neo-slave narrative is a creative reimagination of the first-person slave narratives of authors like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, which you may have read in some of your other African American literature courses. The original slave narratives were generally first person, and they were explicitly designed to mobilize white audiences to support the cause of abolition. The neo-slave narrative is distinct from the slave narrative in terms of genre, obviously. Neo-slave narratives are usually fiction instead of being nonfiction, but it also has to do with the fact that the rhetorical situation is not so concerned with appealing to white audiences. The major impulse of the neo-slave narrative is to tell the story of enslaved African Americans, but also to fill in the blanks that some of those original slave narratives and the historical record have left in that experience, and to do so in a creative way. These narratives also, the neo-slave narratives, also tend to recuperate the history of slavery in ways that are particularly relevant to the moment in which the writer is writing. And Morrison's writing in the 1990s. Morrison's novel, for example, focuses on issues that are very important to African American culture during the 1990s, including what to do with the way that the past continues to form and sometimes deform the present circumstances of African Americans, what to do with the continuing impact of the history of oppression on the nature of Black love and Black families, which was an issue that people were very concerned about during this historical moment. All of these issues were obviously at work during the moment of slavery, but they are also deeply troubling issues and questions for observers of African American culture during the 1990s. The novel can also be read as historical fiction. It's in part based on a very celebrated 1856 case of Margaret Garner. Margaret Garner decided to escape slavery, and she takes off with her family in tow, which was very unusual to begin with. When she is in danger of being recaptured, she actually murders her young daughter. Now, the case presented a lot of problems for the legal system of the day. On the one hand, if enslaved African Americans are only property, is it possible for one piece of property to be held legally accountable for killing another piece of property, is it? And then there was also the issue of, if Margaret Garner is actually a person who has these moral, maternal responsibilities to her family, would it ever be acceptable for her to take the life of her child? Is it morally acceptable for her to take the life of her child to prevent that child from living a life of unending slavery? So it presents a lot of problems for the legal system. Margaret Garner was ultimately classed as property, and she dies in slavery on a Kentucky plantation. Morrison takes that story, though, and imagines what life would have been like for a person who'd made such a decision after the Emancipation Proclamation. So she's definitely filling in some of the blanks and just using that historical tale as a springboard to imagine something much more complicated. There are a couple of things that I'd like you to focus on as you're reading this novel. First of all, I want you to think about the novel as a revision of the genre of the slave narrative, okay? For example, this novel focuses on the experience of the fugitive female slave, a figure we don't really see a lot in the traditional literature of slavery. We just don't see it. And that's because fugitives in this literature were very frequently men. Women tended to be tied down by their responsibilities to community and family, so they were much less likely to run. But in this novel, Morrison chooses to focus on a female fugitive slave's experience and what happens to her after freedom. What does that figure look like? How is it relevant to the concerns of contemporary African American culture, do you think? Second question that's an important one in the novel is, what is the nature of Black love? There's a very famous moment in the novel when Paul D., one of the important male protagonists in the novel, tells Setha, the mother who killed her child, he tells her that her love is too thick. Her love is too thick. In what ways has even the most intimate parts of the Black experience and Black love been shaped by the historical experience of slavery, even after slavery is over? This is also a novel in which Morrison experiments with language. Slavery and the experiences of people who lived through slavery are a kind of historical trauma. And one of the impacts of trauma is that it at times becomes very difficult to find the language to express experiences that really supersedes the mind's ability to comprehend those experiences. That's what trauma is. What kinds of efforts does Morrison make to find that language? What are the moments in which he's experimenting with language to try to capture these experiences? And do you think she's successful in that effort? Okay. And finally, what does the novel have to say about the nature of the past and memory? Are we able to, in that fine American tradition, to completely reinvent ourselves and escape whatever bruises we've received in our past, or whatever limitations are imposed upon us by history? What do we do with the presence of the past in the present? What kinds of things do we have to do with our past in order to have a future? The novel really gets into those questions. So I'm hoping that you'll definitely address those in your discussions this week, okay? That's all. I look forward to seeing your discussion on the discussion board this week.